Mabel Wainwright knew every secret in the territory of New Mexico, and she had never once breathed a word of any of them to a living soul. That was the thing about running the telegraph office in Cotter's Creek, a dusty, sun-baked town that sat along the Santa Fe Railroad line like a forgotten button on an old coat. You became invisible. Ranchers sent wires about money they owed and deals they'd struck under dark skies. Wives sent desperate messages to distant relatives, begging for rescue from marriages that had gone cold as January creek water. The sheriff, a barrel-chested man named Harold Greer, sent coded dispatches to the territorial marshal about outlaws whose names made the barmaids go quiet when they were spoken aloud. Mabel received all of it. She decoded all of it. She filed all of it away in the clean, orderly cabinet of her mind and left it there, untouched, like specimens pressed flat between the pages of a book. It was 1882, and women did not often run telegraph offices alone. Most folk in Cotter's Creek had expected her to fail when her father, Thomas Wainwright, had keeled over from a bad heart the previous winter. He had taught her everything Morse code by lamplight when she was 10 years old, the proper maintenance of the battery cells, the way to coax a signal through bad wire during a dust storm. When he died, Mabel had simply sat down at the desk, smoothed her black mourning skirts over her knees, and continued working. She was 26 years old and she had nowhere else to be. The men in town had opinions. Old Silas Connor at the general store thought it was a shame, a young woman all alone with no husband to see to her. The Reverend Aldous Marsh prayed publicly for her well-being in a way that managed to sound like an accusation. Even Clara Hennessy, who ran the boarding house 2 streets over and was considered the most progressive woman in Cotter's Creek by virtue of owning property, had pulled Mabel aside one afternoon and whispered that she might want to consider whether the work was too taxing for a person of her constitution. Mabel had thanked Clara kindly, gone back to the office, and sent 14 messages before sundown. She was not a flashy woman. She was not the kind of woman that men noticed immediately when they walked into a room. She was medium height, with dark brown hair she pinned back so severely it pulled at her temples, and eyes the particular gray-green color of sage after rain. She wore practical dresses in brown and navy and dark green, and she kept her office spotless. The counter was polished. The equipment gleamed. The single window that looked out onto Main Street was always clean because she washed it herself every Saturday morning before the town woke up. What she was, under all that practicality, was a woman who felt things very deeply and was very careful about letting anyone see it. Perry Walker arrived in Cotter's Creek on the 2nd Wednesday of April, 1882, on the same Santa Fe Railroad line that had made the town worth founding. Mabel watched the train come in from her window. She watched every train. It was professional habit, and she saw the passengers disembark with the idle curiosity she brought to everything. A family with 3 young children, a drummer with a leather satchel the size of a small calf, 2 cowboys who looked like they hadn't slept since El Paso. And then, last off the train, a man who stood on the platform for a moment and just looked at the town the way you might look at a painting you weren't sure you'd paid too much for. He was tall, not remarkable in any other particular way at first glance. He wore a brown duster that had seen considerable weather, and his hat was the kind of battered that suggested real work rather than theater. He had dark hair with a bit of curl to it that the wind caught immediately, and when he turned to collect his saddlebag from the porter, Mabel could see his face in profile, straight nose, square jaw, something in the set of his mouth that was careful and watchful and not unfriendly but not open either. She looked away. Trains brought people constantly. Most of them left again within a week. He came to the telegraph office an hour later. Mabel heard the door and looked up from the battery she was checking. He came in ducking slightly under the frame. He was tall enough to need to, and he took his hat off, which she noticed because not everyone did. He looked around the office with those watchful eyes, taking in the equipment on the counter, The wall of organized slots behind her where incoming messages waited for collection, the clean floor, the single geranium she kept on the windowsill because her father always had. "Morning," he said. "Or afternoon, I suppose. I've lost track." "It is 10 minutes past noon," Mabel said. "What can I do for you?" "I need to send a wire." He came to the counter and set down a folded piece of paper. "To the land office in Santa Fe. I've written it out." She unfolded the paper. The handwriting was clear and deliberate, not the cramped scrawl she usually contended with. The message was straightforward, an inquiry about a parcel of land east of Cotter's Creek, the acreage and deed status, requesting reply at the Cotter's Creek Telegraph office. She counted the words with practiced efficiency. "That will be 60 cents, she said. He paid without argument. She had noticed, over the years, that the way a person paid for a telegram told you something about them. Those who haggled over the price thought the words were worth more than the work of transmitting them. Those who paid quickly and cleanly understood that the service had its own value. He set 3 dimes and a quarter on the counter in even stacks. She waited. Most people, especially men, had something further to say. A comment on the weather. A remark about her being a woman in such a position that was meant to be charming and was usually neither. A question about how long she'd been doing this. He said nothing. He put his hat back on, said thank you in a tone that was genuine rather than polite, and left. Mabel sent his wire and then sat for a moment doing something she almost never did, which was thinking about a stranger. His name she had learned from the paper Perry Walker. It read at the top, in case of reply. She filed the name away with everything else and went back to work. The land office in Santa Fe was efficient, and a reply came the following morning. She filed it in the W slot and waited. He came in that afternoon, again taking his hat off, again giving the office that same careful look. "Walker," she said. "Yes, ma'am." She retrieved the message. He read it standing at the counter with his hat in his hands, and whatever it said, she watched something in his expression settle, not quite relief, but the release of a tension she hadn't been aware he was carrying. "Good news, I take it," she said. She wasn't sure why she said it. She did not usually comment. He looked up. For the first time he really looked at her directly, and she felt the peculiar experience of being seen by someone who was paying genuine attention. His eyes were brown, a dark warm brown with little lines at the corners from squinting in sunlight. "Possibly," he said. "That parcel east of town, the deed is clear. No liens, no contested claims." "You're thinking of buying it," she said. "I'm thinking of building on it." He folded the message and tucked it in his breast pocket. "A cattle operation. Small to start. I know the range is crowded out here, but I've got some backing and a good foreman lined up." She nodded. That was more than most people told her, which was to say, practically everything. Most people collected their messages and left. He had answered her question as though it were a natural thing to do. "The Hendricks Range is to the north of that parcel," she said, because she knew the territory the way she knew the telegraph equipment, thoroughly and without particular fanfare. "William Hendricks runs about 2,000 head. He's been looking to consolidate East Side grazing land for 2 years. You may have competition for that deed." He tilted his head slightly. "You know the land claims around here." "I know everything that comes through this wire," she said simply. Then, because that had sounded rather more significant than she'd intended, she added, "It's useful for business, knowing the lay of things." He studied her for a moment. "I appreciate that," he said. "Miss Wainwright, Mabel Wainwright." "Miss Wainwright." He said it the way people said a name when they were committing it to memory. "I'll keep that in mind about Hendricks. Thank you." He left again, and Mabel went back to her work and told herself firmly that she had simply been helpful, which was part of her job, and that there was nothing further to think about. She thought about it anyway. Perry Walker did not leave Cotter's Creek after a week. He took a room at Clara Hennessy's boarding house, and he moved with the quiet purposefulness of a man who had decided on something and was seeing it through. Mabel saw him most mornings walking toward the land office or the livery stable, and he always raised a hand in greeting when he passed her window, and she always nodded back. And there was nothing in this that was remarkable except that it became the thing she noticed first each morning. He came to the telegraph office regularly. He was negotiating for the land, and the correspondence was extensive with the land office in Santa Fe, with a business partner named Elias Drummond in Denver, with a cattle broker in Texas. Mabel sent all of his messages and received all of his replies, and in doing so she built an incidental picture of his life the way you build a picture from a scattered puzzle. He was 32 years old. He had ranched before, somewhere in Colorado, but something had ended that, she didn't know what, because the messages were always businesslike and forward-looking rather than backward-glancing. The partner in Denver was an old friend rather than a professional acquaintance, based on the tone. He was careful with money but not timid about spending it when necessary, and he always, without fail, took his hat off when he came in. Toward the end of April he came in on a Thursday evening, an hour before she usually closed. The light was going golden and long through the clean window, cutting across the counter in a warm stripe. He was later than his usual time, and there was dust on his duster, and a cut on his left hand that he'd wrapped with a cloth that was not doing an especially good job. "Evening," he said, reaching for his hat and then stopping, because his right hand was carrying his saddle bag. He set the bag on the counter and took his hat off with his injured left hand, wincing slightly. "What happened to your hand?" she asked. "Wire fencing," he said. "I was walking the east boundary line. Ran into some old Hendrix fencing that someone had let go to ruin. The wire caught me." She looked at the cloth. "That needs proper cleaning. Fencing wire carries rust." "I know," he said. "I'll see to it at the boarding house." Clara Hennessy's first aid kit consists of a bottle of whiskey and a good deal of advice, Mabel said. "I have carbolic and proper bandaging in the back." She had said it before she'd fully thought it through. She heard the words in the air between them and felt a flicker of something, not embarrassment exactly, but awareness. He looked at her with those careful eyes. "I don't want to put you to any trouble," he said. "It is no trouble," she said, which was true. She came around the counter, and he followed her through to the small back room where she kept the battery equipment and her personal supplies. There was a chair, and she gestured to it, and he sat, and she brought out the carbolic solution and clean cotton batting and bandaged linen from the cabinet. He unwrapped the cloth, and she looked at the cut. It was a good inch and a half long, not deep enough to need stitching but dirty with the kind of grime that came from old rusted metal, and she understood why she'd offered without fully calculating the social implications of it. He needed the wound properly cleaned. She worked carefully. He held his hand still with the patient steadiness of a man accustomed to discomfort, and she cleaned the cut with carbolic, which she knew stung considerably, and he made no sound. "You've done this before," he said, watching her work. "My father ran this office for 30 years, she said. "Telegraph linemen get hurt regularly. Electrical burns, falls from poles, wire cuts. I've patched up a fair number of men." "Your father," he said. "Not a question exactly." "He died last winter," she said. "Hart, I'm sorry." "Thank you." She was winding the bandaged linen around his hand now. "He taught me everything I know about this work. I don't think he expected me to be doing it alone indefinitely, but..." She paused, adjusted the tension of the bandage. "Here I am." "And you intend to stay?" She looked up at him. They were close together in the small room, close enough that she could see the particular texture of his jaw where he hadn't shaved that morning, the way his dark curling hair fell over his forehead from the removal of his hat. "This is my office," she said. "It was my father's. The equipment, the licenses, the contracts with the railroad. This is what I have, Mr. Walker. Of course I intend to stay." Something shifted in his expression, a quiet respect, or maybe just recognition, as though he understood something about what it meant to stake yourself to a piece of ground and refuse to move. "Of course," he said. She finished the bandage and tied it off, and he flexed his fingers experimentally and thanked her, and she went back to the counter and pretended to review the afternoon's message log while he composed the wire he'd come to send. It was to Elias Drummond in Denver, a brief update on the property situation, and a request for the first draft of the deed funds to be transferred to the Cotter's Creek Bank. He was staying. He was really staying. She sent the wire after he left and sat in the golden evening light for a while, not reviewing any messages at all. May came in warm and bright across the high desert. The territory was beautiful in May, the sky that deep impossible blue, the distant mountains still wearing their snow, the sage coming into its full green. Perry Walker secured his deed on the 8th of May, and Mabel knew it before he did because the confirmation came through her wire first. She filed it carefully in the W slot, and waited with what she recognized was more anticipation than professional courtesy explained. He came in at 11:30, and when he read the message his expression really opened, a full unreserved smile that changed his face completely and made him look younger and less careful for one unguarded moment. "It's done," he said, and then, as though he needed to tell someone and she was the only one at hand, "I've got my land." "Congratulations," she said, and meant it with a warmth she heard in her own voice. He looked at her and that smile was still there, and she felt her own face doing something that was not quite professional neutrality. She looked down at her message log. "I don't suppose," he said, "that you would join me for supper this evening, at the hotel. To celebrate, if that is appropriate." She looked up. He was very carefully not reading anything into his own invitation. He was holding it out as simply as a man could hold out such a thing, with no pressure in it, nothing presumptuous. "That would be very nice," she said. "Yes." She wore her second-best dress, which was dark green with small white buttons down the bodice, and she pinned her hair back only 3/4 of the way so that it wasn't quite so severe. She looked in the small mirror above her washstand at her rooms above the telegraph office. She lived upstairs, had always lived upstairs, the stairs connecting the two parts of her life with their comfortable creaking, and she told herself plainly that she was having supper with a business client, and there was nothing unusual about it. She did not believe herself for a moment. The hotel dining room was the nicest establishment in Cotter's Creek, which was not saying an enormous amount, but the tablecloths were clean and the cook, a Tejano man named Francisco who had once worked at a ranch house outside of San Antonio, produced food that was genuinely excellent. Perry was there before her, standing when she came in, which was a courtesy she had not received in some time, and which landed somewhere in her chest with more impact than she'd expected. They ate roasted chicken and talked for nearly 2 hours. That was the thing she had not anticipated, how easy it was to talk to him. She had expected the conversation of a man focused on practical matters, land and cattle and business, because those were the things she knew of his world. And he did talk about those things, with a directness and intelligence she respected. He had plans for the ranch that were methodical without being rigid. He knew what he was working toward, and he understood the territory, and he wasn't the kind of man who came to the frontier with fantasies about easy wealth. He'd worked ranches since he was 15 years old, in Colorado and Kansas, and one long hard year in Wyoming, and he'd saved and planned and waited for the right moment with the patience of someone who understood that good things required time. But he also asked her questions. Real questions, not the polite conversational questions that existed only to fill silence. He asked how the telegraph network in the territory worked, and she explained the relay stations and the battery maintenance and the challenges of keeping signal through the desert weather. And he listened with the kind of attention that made her feel that what she was saying was genuinely interesting, which it was. She had always found it interesting, but most people's eyes glazed over within 2 sentences. He asked about her father. She told him things she hadn't told anyone in months: Thomas Wainwright's patience, his terrible coffee, the way he used to hum while he sent messages so that the rhythm of the code matched the rhythm of his humming, the loneliness of the winter after he died when the office had been so quiet. "Do you have family elsewhere?" Perry asked. "A cousin in Kansas City," she said. "We write letters. She thinks I should come there and find a husband." She said it without bitterness, just fact. "And what do you think?" he asked. She looked at him across the small table in the warm lamplight of the dining room. "I think this is my work and my place, and I am exactly where I should be," she said. "Then you're luckier than most people," he said. "Knowing that. Do you know it?" she asked. "Now that you have your land," he considered the question as seriously as she'd asked it. "I think I'm working toward knowing it," he said. "The land is the first piece. I need to see it built into something before I'll know for certain that I'm in the right place." "And what's the second piece?" she asked. He looked at her steadily. "I don't know yet," he said, "but I think I'm beginning to find out." She looked at her hands. She picked up her coffee cup and drank from it, and was aware of her own pulse in a way that was entirely inconvenient. They walked back along Main Street together afterward in the warm May evening, with the stars coming up thick and white across the dark sky. The town was settling into its nighttime sounds, the distant piano from the saloon, a horse moving in the livery, the rustle of wind down the street. When they reached the entrance to her office building, he stopped. "Miss Wainwright," he said. "Mabel," she said, and then held her breath slightly because she wasn't sure she'd meant to say it. "Mabel," he said, and the way he said it, quiet and careful, and as though he were tasting the word, made something in her soften completely. "I have very much enjoyed this evening." "As have I," she said. "Would you?" He paused, tried again. "I'd like to call again, if you're willing." She looked up at him in the dark of the street, at his careful, watchful face and the curl of his hair and the battered hat in his hands. "I am willing," she said. He smiled, and she went inside, and she sat in the dark of the office for a full 5 minutes before she could make herself go upstairs to bed. June came with its heat and its long days, and Perry Walker began building his ranch in earnest. He'd hired 4 cowboys, a Mexican vaquero named Rodrigo, who turned out to be one of the best horsemen in the territory, a pair of brothers from Tennessee named Earl and Thomas Birch, who were quiet and hardworking, and a grizzled older man named Frank Osgood, who had been ranching in New Mexico for 20 years and knew the range and the water sources and the cattle markets as well as anyone alive. Together they began the work of fencing and building, and eventually bringing in the first small herd from Texas. Perry came to the telegraph office nearly every day. Some of those visits were business messages to Denver, to the cattle broker, to the feed supplier in Albuquerque. But others were not entirely business. He would come in late in the afternoon, when the day's traffic was light, and lean on the counter, and they would talk. About the ranch, about the territory, about things she'd read in the newspapers that came through with the mail, about things he'd seen in his years of working across the plains and mountains of the West. She found herself learning the vocabulary of his life the way she'd learned Morse code, one element at a time, each one building toward a fluency. She learned that he'd been born in Missouri, youngest of 4, that his mother had died of typhoid when he was 8, and his father had been a man of fine intentions and poor follow-through, who had left the family financially precarious in ways that had formed Perry's careful relationship with money. She learned that he read when he could get books, which was not often out here, and that he had very strong opinions about the proper grazing rotation for high desert range cattle, which she listened to with more attention than she'd have ever predicted she'd give to such a topic, only because it was him speaking. And she told him things in return. She told him about the loneliness of knowing everyone's secrets and being able to share none of them, the peculiar isolation of being trusted absolutely with the private business of the whole territory. She told him about the electrical storm in '79 that had knocked out the line for 4 days, and the particular quiet of those 4 days, the way she'd felt both liberated and completely untethered, like a boat whose mooring line had snapped. She told him about her father's dream of extending the telegraph line to the smaller settlements east of the creek, a project that had died with him and that she sometimes thought about reviving. "You should," Perry said. "You could submit a proposal to Western Union directly. The railroad connection gives you leverage." "The railroad connection is everything," she said. "The town exists because of that line. Before the railroad came through in '78, there was nothing here but a watering hole and a trading post." And now there's a telegraph office run by the most capable woman in the territory, he said. She looked at him. He said it without any particular self-consciousness, as a simple statement of fact, and she felt herself flush slightly in a way she found rather annoying, because she was 26 years old, and flushing was for younger girls with less self-possession. "You are very free with your opinions," she said. "Only when I'm sure of them," he said. She looked down at her work. He was smiling. She could hear it in the quality of the silence. He took her riding on a Sunday in late June. She had a horse, a steady bay mare named Prudence that she kept at the livery, and he brought one of the ranch horses, a red roan that he handled with the effortless ease of a man who had spent most of his life in the saddle. They rode east of town, out toward his land, and he showed her what had been done and what was still to come. The main house was framed and half-walled, a solid square structure built from hauled lumber and local stone. The fence line stretched clean and taut to the southeast. The first stock pond was dug and filling slowly from a diverted stream. It was real. She had known it in the abstract from his messages and his descriptions, but standing in it made it something different. He had made a thing where there had been nothing. "It's good," she said. "You've chosen a good site. The drainage from the mountain will protect you from the dry years." "Frank Osgood said the same thing," Perry said. "That's the main reason I chose this parcel over the one further south. The southern one has an underground spring, but the soil is too alkaline for good grazing," she said. "There was a message from a surveyor 2 years ago. The land was offered to Hendricks first, and he passed on it for exactly that reason." Perry looked at her from the back of the red roan. The afternoon sun was full and warm, and her hat was casting a shadow across her face, and she was looking out at his land with the same calm assessment she brought to everything. "How do you hold all of it?" he asked. "Everything that comes through that wire, every piece of information about every person." "The same way you hold your fence line," she said. "One post at a time." He laughed, a real laugh, full and open, and the sound of it went through her like warm light through glass. They rode back along the creek, where the cottonwoods were thick and green, and the water was still running despite the June heat. The horses drank, and they sat on the bank in the comfortable quiet of two people who had grown easy with each other's presence, and the shadow of a hawk crossed the pale ground between them, and Mabel thought with the clear simplicity of a telegraph message that she was very close to being thoroughly in love with this man, and that the thought frightened her considerably less than she would have expected. Trouble came in July, as trouble in the territory tended to do, quietly, from a direction you hadn't been watching. His name was Douglas Ferris, and he arrived on the same Santa Fe line that had brought Perry Walker in April, and he was a lawyer from Albuquerque representing the interests of William Hendricks. Mabel had been expecting something of this kind since Perry had bought the east parcel, because she had been watching the rhythm of Hendricks's telegraphic correspondence with the careful attention she brought to all of it, and she had seen the shift messages to his lawyer in Albuquerque becoming more frequent, the language becoming more pointed, references to the east boundary that had no context except Perry's new deed. She could not tell Perry any of this. She received messages in professional confidence, and she maintained that confidence absolutely, as her father had before her. It was the foundation of the work. If people could not trust that their messages were private, they would not send them, and the whole system would collapse. She had held this principle through every temptation, and there had been some, over 6 years of running this office, because principle was not principle if you only held it when it was easy. So she watched Douglas Ferris arrive and walk down Main Street toward the land office, and she said nothing. What she could do was what she had done on the second day Perry walked in. She could share what was publicly known, what she knew from observation and general understanding rather than privileged communication. She had done that once, and she could do it carefully again. Perry came in that afternoon looking tight around the eyes. He'd been to the land office himself. "Hendricks is contesting the deed," he said. "He's claiming there was a prior verbal agreement with the previous owner of the parcel." His lawyer arrived today. "I saw him," she said. This could take months to resolve, and while it's in dispute, I can't move forward with the stock purchase." She looked at him. "Does your deed have the proper notarization from the Santa Fe land office?" "Yes." "And the prior owner, did he have any debts to Hendricks?" "Not according to the land office records." "Then a verbal agreement, even if it existed, would not supersede a clear notarized deed," she said. "Territorial law is specific on this. Hendricks knows that. His lawyer knows that." Perry studied her. "Then why bring a lawyer?" "Because some men have more money than patience," she said carefully. "And they believe that making something expensive enough and complicated enough will persuade a person to simply step aside." He was quiet for a moment. "You think it's a pressure tactic?" "I think," she said, choosing each word with the precision she applied to Morse code, "that a man who has been wanting that east boundary for 2 years and failed to secure it before you did might choose aggression over law, particularly if he has resources to sustain a legal challenge indefinitely." "He does," Perry said. "Hendricks has more money than God and twice the lawyers." "Then you need to move quickly. Send a wire to your Denver contact, not about business, about this. If Drummond has any legal resources or can recommend a territorial attorney, now is the time." He was already taking paper from his pocket. She watched him write with that clear, deliberate hand. She sent the wire to Denver, and when he left, she sat for a moment in the specific kind of quiet that came from having held a line very carefully. She had not told him anything from Hendricks's private messages. She had reasoned from observable facts to a conclusion that she believed was correct, and she had shared that reasoning. It was the thinnest of lines, perhaps, but it was hers to hold. Elias Drummond in Denver replied within 2 days with the name of a territorial attorney named James Whitfield, who had made a specialty of land cases in New Mexico, and who came with a considerable reputation. Perry hired him by telegraph immediately, and Whitfield arrived from Santa Fe within the week. Mabel watched this with the quiet satisfaction of seeing a good mechanism work properly. She said nothing about Hendricks's messages, which she continued to receive and file. She said nothing about the fact that Hendricks's lawyer had also sent a wire to an associate in Washington, attempting to find any irregularity in the original survey of the parcel. She held it all in her orderly mind and kept her face professionally even. But she noticed something during those tense weeks of July. She noticed the way Perry moved through the town steady, unhurried, not betraying his worry. She noticed the way he treated his men, Rodrigo and the Birch brothers and old Frank, always directly and respectfully, in the same tone regardless of the news. She noticed that he checked on her in the evening sometimes, not always for business, but stopping to ask how she was, bringing her a piece of pie from the hotel kitchen once and setting it on the counter with the simplest possible gravity, as though the gesture required no explanation. She noticed that she had started watching for him. On a Thursday evening in the middle of July, he came in after closing. She was doing her daily maintenance on the battery cells, which required careful attention and the kind of focus that occupied her hands and left her mind free to wander, and she heard his knock and called out that the door was open. He came in and sat in the chair beside the counter and watched her work. "How does it work?" he asked after a moment. "I've always wondered, the actual mechanism of it." No one had asked her this in years. She looked up. "Electricity," she said. "The battery creates a current. The key breaks and completes the circuit. When the circuit is complete, it activates the magnet in the receiver at the other end, which pulls a lever that marks the paper or makes the clicking sound. Long breaks in the circuit are dashes. Short breaks are dots. The pattern of dashes and dots is the code. How many words a minute can you send?" "About 40 on a clear line," she said. "More if the message is simple." "And receive?" "Faster. Receiving is always faster because you're decoding rather than composing and sending simultaneously." He nodded. He was watching her hands on the battery connections. "Your father taught you all of it." "From the time I was very small," she said. "I used to do my school lessons at that desk." She nodded toward the front counter while he worked. "I could decode messages before I was 12. He said I had an instinct for the rhythm of it." "You do," he said. "I've watched you work." There's something. He paused. It's almost like music, the way you listen." She looked at him. He was entirely serious, not offering a compliment for the sake of offering one, making an observation because it was accurate. "My father used to say the same thing," she said softly. They were quiet together for a moment, and the room was warm with the last of the evening sun, and she became aware that this moment, this specific configuration of lamplight and quiet and his presence in the chair beside her bench, was the kind of moment she would remember clearly and exactly for the rest of her life. "The legal situation," he said. "Whitfield thinks it will be resolved within the month. Hendricks doesn't have the grounds he thought he had." "I thought as much," she said. He looked at her steadily. "You knew before I hired Whitfield, didn't you, that it was a pressure play?" "I reasoned it," she said, "from what I know of land law and what I can observe generally." "Mabel." He said her name in a way that made her set down the wire she was holding. "You know things you can't tell me from the messages." She met his eyes. "Yes, and you don't." "No," she said. "I don't tell anyone at all. It is the job." He held her gaze for a long moment. "I understand," he said. "I want you to know that I understand it and I respect it entirely. I'm not asking you to do otherwise. I see you holding it and I wanted to say that I see it. That's all." The directness of it went straight through her. She picked up the wire again and held it without doing anything useful with it for several seconds. "Thank you," she said, "for saying that. For understanding it," she said. "Most people don't understand why anyone would choose to carry something they don't have to carry." "I think," he said, "that most people don't understand what it means to have a code you hold to regardless of the cost. I think it's a rare thing. And I think it's one of the truest things about you." She was very glad she was facing the battery equipment and not his face, because her expression was doing something entirely unguarded that she would not have known what to do with under direct observation. She loved him. She knew it with the clean clarity she knew a perfect signal on a clear day, unmistakable, precise, and completely undeniable. The legal challenge from Hendricks collapsed in late July, exactly as she had known it would. Perry's attorney James Whitfield produced the notarized deed and 3 supporting witnesses and the prior owner's written statement, and the matter was closed in under an hour at the land office. Douglas Ferris collected his papers and got on the next train east, and that was the end of it. Perry brought her wildflowers that evening. He appeared at the counter with a fistful of the desert blooms that grew along the creek, Indian paintbrush and purple verbena, and the pale yellow of prickly pear blossom held slightly awkwardly, as though he had gathered them with great conviction and was only now considering how to present them. "For being right," he said. She took them and felt herself smiling in a way she was quite sure was not professional at all. "I'm always right," she said, "but these are very welcome." He laughed, and she put the flowers in the glass she kept water in for the geranium, which was perhaps not entirely the right vessel but was what she had, and they stood looking at each other over the counter in the way that had become familiar and warm and entirely comfortable. "I'd like to take you to the hotel for supper again," he said, "and I'd like to walk with you this time if you'll let me." "I'll let you," she said. They went and they walked, and at the end of the evening when they stood at the door to her building he took her hand in both of his left hand still carrying the faint scar from the fencing wire she had cleaned 2 months before, and held it for a moment and said her name, and she looked up at him in the dark street. "I think you know," he said quietly. "I think I do," she said. "Is that—" He stopped, tried again. "Would it be welcome?" She thought of all the things she held back, all the secrets she carried, all the words she never spoke, and for once in her careful professional life she let something out without calculating it first. "Very welcome," she said. He leaned down and kissed her, once, gently, in the warm July night on Main Street in Cotter's Creek, New Mexico, and the stars were doing their thick white summer business overhead, and she felt it in every inch of herself, a warmth that had nothing to do with the temperature and everything to do with him. August was different from all the months before it. It was the difference between a room with the curtains drawn and a room with the window open. Everything was the same, and everything was changed in the way that only one thing can change it: Perry came to the office every day. He still sent business messages. The ranch was progressing. The stock purchase was back on track. A small herd of 37 cattle arrived from Texas on the 2nd of August, and the day they came in he walked into the office with such barely contained delight that she laughed outright, which surprised her as much as it surprised him, because she was not a woman who laughed easily and carelessly, but with him it came naturally, this uncomplicated joy. He brought her things. Books from the catalog order at the general store, selected with such genuine care for her actual interests that she understood he had been listening to everything she'd ever said. A new leather-bound ledger for her message records, her initials tooled on the cover MW, in the kind of work that took time and intention. Peaches from a farm wagon that came through, which were rare and expensive out here, and which he presented with complete matter-of-factness, as though the gesture were entirely ordinary, which made it more generous rather than less. She was not accustomed to being given things. She had provided for herself so entirely for so long that receiving felt unpracticed, like a muscle she'd let atrophy. But he did it without making it into an event, without requiring gratitude in any particular form, and so she accepted and said thank you and found gradually that receiving from someone who gave freely was one of the sweetest things she'd ever learned. She gave in her own way. She told him things about the territory, about the rail line, about the shifts in weather she could read from the behavior of the signals on difficult days. She saved newspaper articles she thought would interest him and left them on the counter without comment. When Frank Osgood came to the office one afternoon to send a wire to his daughter in Tucson, Frank's daughter had a baby coming. Mabel declined the payment because Frank was one of Perry's men and Frank was clearly a good man, and she didn't say anything about it until Frank told Perry, who came in with an expression that was amused and something more than amused. "You can't run a business charging people whatever sentiment moves you," he said. "I charge people whatever is right," she said. "Which is generally what I think it is. And what if your assessment of what's right and the actual price don't align?" "They always do," she said serenely, and went back to her ledger. He shook his head. He was smiling. She could see it even when she was looking at the ledger. The trouble with loving someone, she was finding, was not the loving itself. The loving was remarkably easy. It was the vulnerability of it that was the new territory, the awareness that someone now had the capacity to hurt you in ways that no professional difficulty or financial problem or loss of equipment could replicate. She had held herself apart from this for a long time, not deliberately, but because the work had been her life and the office had been her world and it had seemed enough. It had been enough. But this was something else entirely. She thought about it late one Saturday night, after she'd washed the window as she always did on Saturday mornings, and spent the afternoon on correspondence, and spent the evening with Perry walking along the creek in the long summer twilight. She sat at her desk in the dark office with the lamp turned down low, and she thought, "I am in love with a man who is building something in my territory, and I have told him secrets about myself that I have not told anyone. And he is the first person in my life outside my father who has understood what I do and why it matters. And I am 26 years old and I have never been this afraid of anything and I have never wanted anything this much simultaneously. And I do not know what to do with that." She also thought, "He has not asked me anything definite. He has been very clear in his feelings and in his attentions, but he has not said anything definite." And she was a woman who lived by precision, and she found imprecision in this matter somewhat harder to bear than she would have liked. She picked up her pen and wrote in her private journal, not the message log, the other one, the small one she kept in the drawer beside the battery specifications, 3 sentences. "I am in love with Perry Walker. I believe he loves me. I do not know what happens next." She closed the journal and went to bed. What happened next was September, and a matter that tested everything she was. A message came through on a hot Wednesday morning from the Territorial Marshal's office in Santa Fe, routed to Sheriff Harold Greer. She decoded it as she decoded everything, with professional efficiency, and then she set it in Greer's slot in the message wall and sat very still for a moment. The message concerned a man named Charles Birch, wanted in connection with a robbery in Albuquerque 6 months prior. The description in the message was precise enough. The problem was that among the 4 men Perry Walker employed on his ranch, there were 2 brothers named Birch, Earl, and Thomas. Thomas Birch was 22 years old. He was quiet and hardworking, as she'd noted when she'd first seen them arrive with Perry. He was not Charles Birch, but Charles Birch was described in the marshal's message as traveling under an assumed name, and the physical description, 20 or so years of age, sandy hair, medium build, scar on the right forearm, could have applied to Thomas. Could have. It was not certain. She did not know. And here was the place where everything she was met in collision. She had information that bore on the welfare of someone connected to Perry. She had received it in professional confidence, and it was addressed to the sheriff, and it was his business to act on it, not hers to interpret. She would not read the marshal's messages as relevant to her personal life. She put the message in Greer's slot. She sent a message to Greer's office boy telling the sheriff he had a priority message from Santa Fe. And then she went through the rest of the day's business with her hands steady and her face even and her insides doing something that was not quite as steady. Greer came and collected his message. She watched from the corner of her eye as he read it, watched his expression sharpen and go professional, watched him fold the message and leave. She did not know what happened next. She was not supposed to know. She sent Perry's daily business messages when they came in. She sent a wire for Rodrigo to his family in Chihuahua. She served the afternoon traffic and closed the office at the usual time and went upstairs and ate supper alone and tried to read the novel she'd been working through all month and found she couldn't. 2 days later, Perry came in with a face that had had a hard night or two. "Thomas Birch," he said, without preamble. "The marshal's men came to the ranch yesterday morning. They took him for questioning." She looked at him. She could not say, "I know." She could not say, "The message came through my wire." She could only listen. "He swears he's not this Charles Birch they're looking for," Perry said. "And I believe him. I've worked with Thomas for 4 months. He's a good man, a steady worker. He's got a younger sister in Tennessee he's been saving to bring out west. None of it fits what they're describing." "What do the marshal's men say?" she asked. "That the description is close enough to warrant holding him in Santa Fe for identification by the witnesses from the Albuquerque robbery." Perry put his hands on the counter. "Earl went with them to testify for his brother's character. The ranch is short 2 men, and that's the least of my worries. If Thomas is wrongly identified, then a lawyer," she said. "The same attorney, Whitfield, who handled your land case. He practices criminal defense in the territory." "I've already sent word," Perry said, "but it won't be fast. And a man held on suspicion while his reputation is damaged." "I know," she said gently. He looked at her. "You're very calm." "Because one of us should be," she said. "Thomas Birch, if he is innocent, has done nothing wrong, and the law has mechanisms to establish that. It is frightening and unjust to be held on suspicion of a thing you haven't done, but the process exists. The process is slow." "Yes," she said. "That is its great failing." She paused. "There is something you can do for Thomas that may help establish his character more quickly. Do you know where he was on the date of the Albuquerque robbery? If he was here in Cotter's Creek, March 3rd, Perry said immediately. "I know because it was the week I signed the deed. He was here. He was working on the building site with Frank and Earl." "Then Frank Osgood can provide a sworn statement," she said. "And your own records of when he started work should show the date. Alibi evidence." She slid a piece of paper across the counter and a pen. "Write down everything you can remember about that week. Dates, witnesses, specifics. I'll send a wire to Whitfield directly if you want." He picked up the pen and wrote, and she watched him work with the focused attention of a man channeling his worry into action, which was exactly the right thing for him to do, and she felt a fierce, uncomplicated love for the directness of him. The wire went to Whitfield. The alibi was documented. It took 10 days, during which Perry was preoccupied and the ranch was short-handed, and the town held its breath in the way small towns do when one of their people is in trouble, even when that person had been there only months. Thomas Birch was released. He was not Charles Birch. The identification witnesses in Albuquerque confirmed that the man they were looking for had a different build, a different accent, a scar in a different configuration. Thomas came back to Cotter's Creek thin and pale and deeply shaken, and Perry drove out to meet the stage himself and brought him back to the ranch. And that evening Mabel heard, through the ordinary channels of small-town life, that Perry had sat up with Thomas most of the night talking about nothing in particular, just making sure the man wasn't alone. She thought, there he is. There is the whole of him, the thing I'd been looking at piece by piece and not quite seeing all at once until now. He is a man who sits up with his people. She was so entirely in love with him that it occupied her like weather. He came to the office the next afternoon, and she could see the sleeplessness in his face and the relief that hadn't quite finished replacing the worry, and he leaned on the counter and she looked at him and neither of them said anything for a moment. "He's all right," Perry said finally. "I'm glad," she said. "This territory," he said, "it can be hard and fast and completely indifferent." "Yes," she said, "but there are good people in it." He looked at her steadily. "The best people," he said, and she understood clearly that he was talking about her. She straightened her already straight message log and said, "Do you need to send any wires today?" He said, "No, I just wanted to be here for a while." She nodded and went on with her work, and he sat in the chair beside the counter and read one of the newspapers from the mail stack, and that was all, and it was more than enough. October came with its extraordinary light, the desert going gold and amber and a low amber sun that made everything look like a painting. Perry had his small herd settled on the East Range. The fences were sound. The main house was finished enough to live in, and his foreman Frank Osgood had moved his own bedroll into the bunkhouse with Rodrigo and the Birch brothers. The ranch was functioning. It was a small operation still, but it was real and running, and it was his. He took her to see the finished house on a Sunday afternoon, riding east in the October light, and she stood in the doorway of it and looked at the clean square rooms and the riverstone fireplace and the long window that looked north toward the mountains, and she felt something in her chest expand, as though she'd taken a deeper breath than usual. "What do you think?" he asked. He was watching her face. "I think it's a fine house," she said. "I think so too," he said. He was quiet for a moment. He was standing close enough that she could feel the warmth of him beside her. "I think it needs more in it than I've put there so far." She looked at the empty room. "Furniture," she said. "A rug." "Yes," he said, "and a life being lived in it." He paused. "Mabel." She turned and looked at him. He was very serious and very steady, which was entirely characteristic of him. He held her gaze with those warm, dark eyes. "I'm going to ask you something," he said, "and I want you to understand that I've thought about it carefully, and I know my mind completely, and I am not asking casually." Her heart had taken up residence somewhere in her throat. She kept her face even by main force of habit. "I want you to marry me," he said. "I want you to go on being exactly who you are, in that office, with your work and your ledger and your perfect principles and your geranium and your knowledge of everything in this territory. I am not asking you to give any of that up. I am asking you to let me be a part of your life in the way I want to be, which is the permanent way, which is the way where I come home to you." She looked at him for a long moment. "Where you come home to me," she said. "From the ranch. Every evening," he said, "if you'll have me." She thought about the journal entry she'd written in September. "I do not know what happens next." She knew now. "Yes," she said, "I'll have you." He took her face in both his hands with such gentleness and kissed her, there in the doorway of his new house with the mountains in the window behind her, and the October light coming gold across the stone floor, and she closed her eyes and thought, "This is what it is to know where you are supposed to be." They were married in November, at the church in Cotter's Creek, by Reverend Aldous Marsh, who had the decency to look genuinely pleased rather than merely pious, because even he had eyes and could see that something right was happening. Clara Hennessy cried. Frank Osgood wore a jacket that had not seen daylight in at least 3 years. Rodrigo brought flowers from somewhere, nobody was sure where in November, and wove them into an arrangement that sat on the altar with more style than anything else in the church. Mabel wore her mother's dress, which Clara had helped her let out slightly in the bodice, ivory silk gone to the color of old lace, with her dark hair pinned back but not severely 3/4, as she'd done for that first supper. She walked down the aisle of the small church on no one's arm, because she had no father to give her and no brother, and she was a woman who had walked under her own power for long enough that it felt entirely appropriate to continue doing so. Perry stood at the altar in a new suit, charcoal wool, properly fitted, hat absent, and when she came level with him, his expression was the most fully open thing she had ever seen on his face. No careful watchfulness, no reserve. Just him, entirely and completely. She had never liked ceremonies particularly. She found them overwrought. But this one in this small plain church in a dusty railroad town in the New Mexico territory, with these people around her whom she had served and known and kept silent about for years, felt exactly right, and not one word too long. She became Mabel Walker before the month was out, though she kept Wainwright for the business, because the telegraph office was the Wainwright office and always had been and always would be. And Perry agreed without hesitation that she should keep it because he understood, as she had told him on the second day she'd ever spoken to him, that this was her work and her place, and she was exactly where she should be. They were married at the end of November and they moved into the ranch house together, and she kept the office. She rode into town each morning on Prudence the bay mare, sent and received the territory's messages, held all its secrets in her orderly mind, and rode back each evening to the house with the mountain window and the river stone fireplace. It was the same work and it was entirely different, because every evening there was a lamp burning in a window when she came up the path, and that lamp meant him. Winter settled over the high desert with the particular severity of New Mexico winters, cold, dry, breathtakingly clear. The sky a deep navy blue at night with stars so close you could believe you might reach them. Perry learned the ranch's winter rhythms, which were different from Colorado's, drier and less brutal but demanding their own attentions, and Mabel learned the rhythms of the house and added them to all her other rhythms, the morning ride and the battery check and the message flow, and the long quiet afternoons and the evenings by the fireplace. They read to each other. This was something she had not anticipated and which became one of her profound pleasures. He had ordered books from the catalog, a mix of practical volumes on ranching and land management, and with a touch of shyness she found disarming, several novels. She read to him while he worked at the table on his ranch accounts, and he read to her while she knitted, which was a skill she was learning with more determination than aptitude, and which produced results that were technically functional if not aesthetically distinguished. He told her, in the long winter evenings, things he had not told anyone, about Colorado, which was what she'd wondered about from the beginning. He'd had a partner there, a man named Robert Kane, and they'd built a small operation together, and Kane had borrowed heavily without telling Perry, and when the debts came due the ranch was gone. Perry had walked away from 2 years of his labor with nothing but his horse and his tools, and a lesson that had shaped everything about the way he'd built this new venture carefully, transparently, without hidden obligations. "Is that why you're so careful with the business accounts?" she asked. "It's why I'm careful with everything I'm building," he said, "because I've seen what happens when the foundation isn't sound." She set down her knitting and looked at him across the table. "Your foundation here is sound," she said. "I know it," he said, "but you still check it every day." "I do," he said, and looked at her steadily. "Old habits are hard to break." "Some habits are worth keeping," she said. He smiled, that full, unreserved smile she'd first seen when he got the deed confirmation, and reached across the table and took her hand. And they sat that way for a while in the firelight with the winter dark outside and the coyotes calling distantly across the desert. And she felt the particular weight of a happiness that was not fragile or contingent but solid and earned. Spring came back to the territory the way it always did, all at once and gloriously. February gave way to March, and March gave way to April, and suddenly the high desert was covered in its brief, extravagant bloom, and the mountains were running with snowmelt, and the cattle on the East Range were putting on weight, and the telegraph line was busy with spring business coming through from all directions. Mabel made the ride into town each morning with the particular pleasure of someone who has built a routine that fits them perfectly. She knew which rocks Prudence preferred to avoid along the creek crossing. She knew that the Hendricks cattle, pastured to the north, had a habit of gathering along the fence line in early morning, and she had made her peace with Hendricks himself, who had turned out to be a difficult man but not an evil one, and who had come in twice to send wires that she'd handled with professional neutrality, and he had done her the courtesy of treating her the same way. She was happy. It was not a complicated happiness or a dramatic one. It was the happiness of a woman who had found, against modest expectation, exactly the life she needed. In April, 1 year after Perry Walker had first walked through her door with his hat in his hand, she sent a wire to her cousin Agnes in Kansas City. The message was brief: "Married last November to a good man, well and happy. He listens when I talk. Do not worry any more." Agnes's reply came the following morning: "You have surprised me entirely. I am so glad. Tell me everything." Mabel laughed, which she did more frequently now, and which still surprised her sometimes by its ease. She told Agnes quite a lot in a letter that she wrote and posted that evening. She described Perry, his steady care, his directness, his understanding of the work. She described the ranch and the house with the mountain window. She described the life she had not expected and had found anyway, and in writing it down, she felt the shape of it clearly. She had spent 6 years knowing everyone's secrets and holding them in perfect trust, and she had built a life of such careful privacy and professional discretion that she had not noticed, until one April morning when a man came in and took his hat off, that she had kept one secret from herself as well. The secret that she wanted this company, partnership, a specific pair of warm, dark eyes and a hand she could trust. She had not told anyone that secret either for quite a long time. But she'd told him eventually, in pieces, through every conversation and every evening and every honest thing she'd said and meant. She had told him by marrying him. She told him every day. Late in April, almost exactly a year from his arrival, she told him something else. She waited until an evening when the fire was going and the supper things were cleared and the ranch accounts were done, and she sat across from him at the table with her hands flat on the wood and said, in a tone that she was trying to keep even but which she could hear trembling slightly at the edges, that she believed she was expecting a child. He went entirely still for 3 seconds. Then he got up from his chair and came around the table and took her hands in both of his and looked at her with an expression she did not have a word for, which was entirely new, something composed of wonder and fierce tenderness and something very close to reverence. "Mabel," he said. "Yes," she said. Are you well? How are you feeling?" "I feel perfectly fine," she said. "I feel perhaps more emotional than usual and somewhat more tired in the mornings, but otherwise quite well." "You don't have to ride into town," he said immediately. "I can bring the messages out." "Perry," she said firmly, "I am expecting a child, not dissolving. I will continue to ride into town for a reasonable period and we will reassess as the situation develops." He looked at her for a moment. Then that smile broke across his face, full, unreserved, entirely joyful. "The situation develops," he repeated. "You are the most extraordinary woman." "I know," she said, and smiled back at him with everything she had. She did ride into town for a reasonable period, as she'd said, through May and well into June, when the heat was high, and her riding became somewhat more deliberate. Clara Hennessy, who had appointed herself a kind of auxiliary family to both of them, came to the ranch on Sundays and provided opinions on everything from diet to room arrangement, with the cheerful authority of someone who had been waiting a long time to be needed in this way. Frank Osgood, when he learned the news, went so red in the face with suppressed emotion that Rodrigo had to clap him on the back to get him breathing normally again. The territory went on doing what territories do, booming and struggling, and sending messages through the wire that Mabel received and decoded and filed and held. A significant message came through in June from the land office in Santa Fe, a general circular about new surveying of the eastern ranges, which told her that the territory was growing, filling in, the wildness being measured and mapped, and the maps being sent along wires like hers to people who would build on them. She thought of her father, who had seen the territory when there was barely a wire to carry it, and she thought of her child, who would know a territory changed by all the years between. She felt, with the child growing steadily and the ranch building steadily and the summer heat breaking gradually into September's gold, that she was standing at the precise center of something, her father's past and her child's future, the wild territory and its slow civilization, her solitary years and this new partnership. She stood at the center of all of it, and she sent her messages, and she held her secrets, and she went home each evening to the lamp burning in the window. Perry was there every evening. That was the thing she had not known she needed until she had it, and now could not imagine without. The simple fact of a specific person waiting. He came in from the range dusty and tired, and asked about the day's traffic, and listened with genuine interest to the things she could tell him. The news from the territory, the movement of cattle prices that came through business wires, the weather from the line stations east and west. He did not ask about what she couldn't tell him, and she had never loved that absence of pressure more than she did now, with the child making itself known in ever more insistent ways. Their son was born on the 18th of December, 1882, during a cold, clear night with the stars enormous, and the ranch perfectly still except for the sounds that mattered. Clara Hennessy was there, because Clara had made it clear that her attendance was not optional, and a doctor named Calvert had come out from town, a capable older man who had delivered half the children in the territory. He was a healthy, substantial baby boy with dark hair already visible, and his mother's gray-green eyes and his father's square, determined jaw. Perry held him for the first time in the gray pre-dawn, sitting in the chair by the fireplace, with the look of a man who has discovered an entirely new category of feeling that no previous experience has prepared him for, and Mabel watched from the bed and thought that this was possibly the most beautiful thing she had ever seen in her life, and she had not expected to think that and was entirely undone by it. "What do we call him?" Perry asked. "Thomas," she said. He looked up. He understood immediately, not Thomas Birch the ranch hand, though she liked Thomas Birch well enough, but the fact of naming, the fact of choosing something solid and good. He nodded. "Thomas," he said to the baby, who was entirely unimpressed with the conversation, and Perry smiled down at him in the firelight, and Mabel thought, "There is my whole life right there in that chair." Thomas Walker proved to be an energetic and intensely curious person from the very first weeks. He had opinions about everything: feeding times, the quality of his blanket, the proximity of firelight, the specific pitch of voices in the house. Perry, who had grown up with siblings and was entirely comfortable with small children, managed this with a patience that Mabel observed with great appreciation, because her own experience of small children was limited, and the reality of Thomas was occasionally rather a lot. She went back to the Telegraph office in February, when Thomas was 8 weeks old. Clara Hennessy came to the ranch 3 days a week to be with the baby, and on the other days Perry arranged his work to be at the house. It was a complicated arrangement, and it required negotiation and flexibility from both of them, and they negotiated it directly, as they did everything, without pride or performance. "I need the office," she told him plainly one morning. "Not because I don't love being here, because the office is part of what I am, and if I stay away from it too long I'll lose something that matters." "I know," he said. "I've always known that. We'll make it work." And they did. The spring of 1883 came in warm and early, and the territory was full of the energies of the time, the railroads extending, the towns growing, the old wild spaces being pressed on all sides by new settlement. There were troubles, as there always were in those years, disagreements between ranchers and new settlers over water rights, the continuing and deeply unjust pressures on the Apache communities to the south and west, the conflicts over land that Mabel received messages about and held in her careful mind along with everything else. She was not unaware of the injustices of the territory. The way Apache land was taken with the backing of law that had not been made for Apache people, the way Mexican families who had held land for generations found themselves squeezed by legal mechanisms they'd had no hand in creating. She received messages from officials about these matters, and she received messages from ranchers and settlers about them, and she received, occasionally, messages that were about real human suffering, and she held all of it with a seriousness that sometimes sat heavy. She talked to Perry about it in the evenings, about what she could say without violating confidences, about the general texture of it, the shape of a territory in the process of being remade in ways that were not equally fair to everyone in it. He listened. He didn't dismiss it or minimize it. "The Rodrigo I hired," he said once, "has family who have ranched this territory for 3 generations. His grandfather's land was absorbed into the Hendricks Range 20 years ago by means that weren't entirely legal. He knows every water source on this range because his family found them. I know that, and I do my best to treat him accordingly." "That's not the same as justice," she said. "No," he agreed. "It isn't, but it's what I can do from where I stand." She nodded. She understood the limits of what could be done from where one stood. She held the wider picture in her mind and did what she could with the small piece of it that was hers. She had always worked that way. That summer Thomas learned to roll over and then to sit, and then to look at everything in his near vicinity with a focused intensity that Perry said was exactly his mother, and which Mabel denied on the grounds that she was not that obvious about it. "You absolutely are," Perry said. "When something interests you, you become entirely still and you look at it with your whole face. I don't. You did it when you were checking the battery connections that first evening I watched you work," he said. Exactly like that. He nodded at the baby, who was examining a brass button with forensic attention. She looked at the baby and then at Perry and then at the baby again. "That is extremely particular information to have retained," she said. "I retain particular information about things that interest me," he said simply, and she felt that warmth in her chest that she'd stopped even trying to qualify and simply accepted as the permanent condition of loving him. The telegraph line proposal she'd thought about for years, her father's unfinished dream of extending the line to the smaller eastern settlements. She submitted to Western Union in August of 1883. She wrote the proposal herself at the office desk in the evenings after the day's traffic was done. She used her railroad connection data and her 6 years of message traffic records to demonstrate the commercial viability, because Western Union was a business and business arguments were what moved businesses. The reply came in October, approved, conditional on local infrastructure coordination. She sat with the message in her hands for a full minute before she allowed herself the private, complete satisfaction of it. She told Perry that evening. He set down the ranch account book and looked at her and said, "Your father would have been very proud." She pressed her lips together. She was not a woman who cried easily, and she was not going to start now, but it took her a moment. "Yes," she said. "I think he would have." Perry came around the table and put his arms around her, and she leaned into him, and they stood that way by the firelight while Thomas slept in his crib in the corner with the determined intensity of a small person who had decided that sleeping was currently his project. And the winter dark was outside, and the territory was going on doing what it did, wild and difficult and beautiful and full of messages passing through her wire every day. The extension work began the following spring. Western Union sent a crew and Mabel coordinated every detail with the precision that was her natural mode. And by June of 1884, the line ran east through 2 new settlements, each of which now had relay capability, and a trained operator young men she'd selected and supervised the training of herself. because she had learned from her father, and she understood the value of passing it forward. Perry took on more cattle that year. The operation had grown steadily, and he'd hired 2 additional hands, a young man from Albuquerque and a quiet fellow from Sonora who had papers that he carried carefully and who was, Rodrigo said, one of the best cattle men he'd ever worked alongside. The ranch was a functioning thing, a real thing, built one careful decision at a time into something that had permanence and order. On a warm evening in September of 1884, Perry and Mabel sat on the porch of the ranch house. They had built a porch that sprang broad and facing west, which caught the evening light, and Thomas, now nearly 2 years old, sat between them examining a stick with the same thoroughness he brought to all objects, and the mountains to the north were going rose and amber in the long September sunset. "I've been thinking," Perry said. "You're always thinking," she said. "That's why you need the porch, room to do it." He smiled. "I've been thinking that this is the life I was working toward, that I've arrived at it." She looked at him. And it's better than I expected," he said, "considerably, because I hadn't accounted for you." She looked at the mountains. She felt that expansion in her chest again, the deeper breath. "You hadn't. I came here for the land," he said. "I came to build a ranch. That was the plan, the whole plan. I had not planned to walk into a telegraph office and meet a woman who knew every secret in the territory and would never tell a one of them, and who cleaned my hand with carbolic and told me about land law and chose a career over convention, and had a geranium on the windowsill and her father's whole life in her eyes." She was quiet for a moment. Thomas dropped his stick and immediately looked for it with focused alarm. "It's there," Perry said to him, pointing. Thomas retrieved it with satisfaction. "I hadn't planned you either," Mabel said. "I had a good life, a sufficient life. I had work I believed in and a place that was mine. And now—" She looked at him sideways in the September light. "Now I have all of that," she said, "and a porch, and someone who takes his hat off when he comes in, and a small boy who will very shortly be talking, at which point we'll both have considerably less quiet than we're accustomed to." "Are you sorry?" he asked. The question was easy, without weight, because he already knew the answer and was asking for the pleasure of hearing it. "Not for one single morning," she said. He reached over Thomas's head and took her hand, and they sat that way until the sun was gone, and the first stars came up cold and thick, and the stick lost its appeal, and Perry carried Thomas inside to bed, and Mabel sat on the porch alone for one more minute in the full dark of the high desert, listening to the coyotes and the wind and the distant sound of the telegraph wire singing along its poles in the night air, the current always running, the messages always moving, the territory's secrets safe in her care. She was still that woman, the one who knew everything and said nothing, who kept the office clean and the batteries charged and the signals clear through every kind of weather. She was still precisely herself, which was the thing she had been most afraid of losing and had not lost at all. She was also more than she had been. That was the unexpected gift of it, not replacement but addition, not a new self but a fuller one. She went inside to where the lamp was burning, and her husband was reading to their son from a book of illustrations of animals, naming each one with the patient repetition of a man who understood that some things needed to be said many times before they were fully learned, and Thomas was paying the kind of attention that was very much his mother's, still and absolute. She stood in the doorway for a moment, looking at them, and then she came in and closed the door against the September night, and the wire sang outside in the dark, and the territory held its 1,000 secrets, and she held hers, this one, the warmest one, the one she kept not out of professional duty, but out of something far older and more fundamental than any code she'd ever learned to read. The years that followed built themselves one upon another with the solid, satisfying weight of things made to last. The telegraph line extension became the line extension's extension, and the next year brought another relay station further east, and Mabel's network grew with the territory. She trained 3 more operators over the next several years, 2 of them women, a decision that drew commentary from the usual sources, and which she dismissed with the same serene efficiency she'd been applying to such commentary since 1881. Thomas Walker grew into a dark-haired, gray-eyed boy who was fascinated by the telegraph equipment from the moment he was old enough to be brought safely to the office, and who began, at the age of 4, to learn the code from his mother with the same lamplight patience his grandfather had used with her. Perry watched this one evening, Thomas sitting very straight at the practice key, Mabel beside him with infinite patience, ... and his expression was the most private, complete, deeply satisfied look she had ever seen on him. "What are you smiling at?" she asked him without looking up from Thomas's hands. "Everything," he said, which was not specific and was the only possible answer. In the spring of 1886, their daughter arrived, small and determined and immediately opinionated, whom they named Clara after Clara Hennessy, who wept so comprehensively at the news that she had to be given a glass of water. Clara Walker had her father's dark curling hair and her mother's habit of absolute stillness when something caught her interest, and she took to the world with the particular confidence of a person who has never had reason to doubt her welcome. Frank Osgood, who had by this time been with the ranch long enough to consider himself a permanent fixture, presented Clara with a carved wooden horse at her first birthday party, the workmanship suggesting that he had started it considerably earlier and had been waiting for the occasion. He was a man of very few words and very deep feeling, which Mabel respected enormously, and she thanked him with a directness that matched his own, and he went red in the face again and said it was nothing and went to see to the fence line. The ranch grew. The telegraph line grew. The territory grew around them both, changing and pressing and sometimes beautiful and sometimes hard and never for one moment dull, because the messages kept coming and the cattle kept ranging, and the children kept discovering new aspects of the world that required explanation, and there were always repairs to be made and accounts to be settled and seasons to be moved through. Perry Walker had arrived in Cotter's Creek as a man who had lost one thing he'd built and had come to try again, and he had found his land and built his ranch and stayed, which was the whole of his plan, and also found everything else, which he had not planned at all and which was, he said on various evenings in various ways, the best work he'd ever done. Mabel Wainwright had been sitting in her father's office holding the territory's secrets and running the wire and washing the window every Saturday, and being sufficient to herself and expecting, in some reasonable portion of her mind, to go on that way indefinitely. She had not expected the door to open one April morning and for a man to come in and take his hat off. She had the geranium still. It sat on the windowsill exactly where it had always sat, the same stubborn flowering plant that had survived 6 years of a telegraph office's particular neglect, and then thrived under the slightly more attentive care that came with having more life in the building. It was, she had decided, as close to a symbol as she was inclined to allow herself something that bloomed in difficult conditions and required very little and gave back more than you expected. She sat at the telegraph desk on a bright October morning in 1887, 5 years after a train had come in, and she'd watched a man stand on the platform and consider the town. Thomas was in school. The Cotter's Creek School had grown to accommodate a real teacher and a proper building. Clara was with Clara Hennessy for the morning. The office was quiet and clean, and the batteries were sound, and the wire was running clear. She received a message from the Santa Fe relay station, business of the ordinary kind, and decoded it and filed it with the automatic ease of 10 years of practice, and then she sat for a moment in the October light. She had told one man the truth about herself. Not her secrets, those belonged to the office and the wire and the people who trusted them there. But the truest things about herself, the things that were her and not her work, the fear and the longing and the capacity for a love she hadn't been sure she had in her, those she had told Perry Walker, one piece at a time, over many evenings in lamplight, and he had received each piece with the same careful attention he brought to everything important, and he had kept them as she kept everything, absolutely, and with his whole heart. She was thinking this when she heard hooves on the road and looked through the clean window and saw him coming along Main Street on the red roan, which was getting on in years now, but still the finest horse on the East Range in Perry's opinion. He was coming toward town at his usual steady pace, and she watched him the way she had always watched things that interested her, with complete stillness and her whole face. And when he came level with the window, he turned and looked through it at her and raised his hand, and she raised hers back. He pulled up at the hitching post and came in through the door and took his hat off, as he had done every single time for 5 years, and came to the counter, and she looked at him. "What are you doing in town?" she asked. "I had a message to send," he said. He put a folded piece of paper on the counter. She unfolded it. It was addressed to Elias Drummond in Denver, his old friend. It read, "All well here. Ranch is sound. 2 fine children. Married 5 years this November to the best woman in the territory. Every day better than the last. No news otherwise. Walker." She looked at it for a long moment and then looked up at him. "This is going to cost you," she said. "I know," he said. "Word count is very specific. This is going to be 60 cents. "I know," he said. She was trying not to smile and failing. She picked up her key and began to send. He stood at the counter while she sent his message, in the same office where she had first learned his name from the top of a paper, and thought about a stranger for 2 minutes longer than was professional. And the morning light came through the clean window, and the geranium was doing whatever geraniums do in October, which is go quietly on in their understated way. And she sent every word of his message out on the clear wire over the wide, wild, beautiful territory. And when she was done, she set the key down and looked at him. "Sent," she said. "Thank you," he said, as he always did, with the same genuine weight. He put his hat back on, then he took it back off. "I thought," he said, "that if you don't have much traffic this morning, I might stay a while." "Stay as long as you like," she said. He sat in the chair beside the counter, the same chair he had always used, and she went back to her work, and the wire sang through its poles across the high desert morning, and every secret in the territory ran through her hands and stayed there, held in complete trust. And the one secret she had kept, the warmest one, the most important one, sat across the counter from her in a battered hat and smiled, and she smiled back, and the morning opened up around them like a country with no end.